You know, the Jackson family have always been people that I've loved to collect records by, including Jermaine. And, you know, that's a reference I always like to put into that if you've watched my other videos with my boyfriend Scott. And the thing about the Jacksons was, I was getting into them really heavy at a time about a decade before I had internet. And the thing about the Jacksons, too, was that if you went into CD stores, you most commonly saw music by Michael Jackson, of course, Janet Jackson, even some obscure stuff, and the Jacksons, Jackson 5. But you never really saw a lot of solo releases by the other brothers in the family. I knew Marlon had one out, I knew the sister Maureen, Rebe, had one, and I knew that Jermaine had a huge career. And I bought a CD called Jermaine Jackson's Greatest Hits and Rare Classics. It was right behind the CD of Let's Get Serious, the original Motown CD, which I'm still kicking myself for not getting because, as most of you Jermaine fans out there know, a good chunk of Jermaine's solo career has never been issued in this country or in any country on CD, especially his Motown work. And what happened is that in 1972, Motown, of course, launched Jermaine and Michael as solo acts. But those early solo albums were still kind of based on the Jackson 5 in a way, especially Michael's. But, you know, Jermaine, they kind of were positioning him as a teen idol, you know, being a little older. And as with all the other Jackson members, you know, all the best people at Motown in terms of writers and musicians were working with Jermaine. You know, he really didn't have a lot of participation creatively in those early albums. So 1977 came along, and, you know, 1977 is a major year for funk. And, you know, what inspired me to do this video, as I'm getting all my vinyl together, I want to do more collection videos in the future, but the inspiration for this album review came from my friend Henrique. You know, shout out to you, Henrique. You know, and he's been doing some amazing work on the year 1987, the time period both he and I were children in and remember well, especially in that context. And he did the Prince song, Sign of the Times, the Whisper song, Rocksteady. You know, you should go check it out if you're on there. You know, it's Rique Speaks on WordPress, all one word. And check out his blog. You know, he does some amazing things on there with funk and soul and jazz and different, you know, cultural things in the black community especially. But when I was starting to kind of crate dig, before I knew what the term was, I would always seek out those Jermaine solo albums from the 70s because that Greatest Hits and Rare Classics had all these great songs on it, but they didn't really label what they were from. It was kind of a patched together set in terms of how the liner notes were written, so I just have to figure it out. And I was at a record store called Enterprise in Portland, which has since moved location in that city, but are still there, and I came across this. I would say probably around 1995, 96, so I've had this record for about 22 years. And, you know, this was at a time before I knew how to really take care of records, so this record is in pretty bad shape and pretty scuffed up because I really did wear the grooves out on this. And, you know, when I think back on 1977, it was a really tremendous year in terms of funk. You know, you had Parliament and Funkintelligy versus the Placebo Syndrome. You know, you had Ask Rufus by Rufus. Of course, you had Earth, Wind and Fire with All in All. And you even had some kind of more obscure things like Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson's album Bridges. And then you had great stuff on the jazz funk side. You had the Crusaders' Free as the Wind. You know, so you had some really great things happening in 1977. And, you know, Brick's self-titled second album, which was amazing as well. Weather Reports, Heavy Weather, all that stuff came out in 77. And to me, having lived with this album so long, especially with Jermaine's Motown content never having been on CD for the most part, I waited and waited and waited for this album to be released on CD. I seldom see it for sale on vinyl, and I need to get it again if I find it or order it offline because I love this album absolutely to death. And in a way, Motown really was kind of trying to farm out some of its acts at this point, and a lot of the acts were leaving because they were kind of at a standstill in the disco era. They released some good singles like Thelma Houston's Don't Leave Me This Way. The Commodores had Brick House at that time, but Motown wasn't what it was in the 60s. We all know that. And when the Jacksons left, Jermaine obviously didn't go with them. Now, there's some debate about why, but he became a solo artist at Motown right at the time where Motown wasn't really in the interest of supporting a solo artist, especially a defector Jackson, as it were. And Jermaine kind of got caught up in that. And in 1976, he released an album called My Name is Jermaine. And on the follow-up, he decided to come in and write a lot more music and get more involved in the creative process. And this cover shows, a very happy Jermaine and a very confident one. The album is called Feel the Fire, and his bass, it's a rhinestone-studded bass, is literally on fire on this album. So when I saw this, that cover just got my attention. I thought, this is going to be some fiery music here. And it sure is. It was produced by Jermaine Jackson and Michael McLaury, I think is how it's pronounced. Now, it starts right off with the song Feel the Fire, Burning From Me to You. Now, this is a serious bass guitar funk kind of number. Really close to the Brothers Johnson, to be honest with you. It just really has that vibe to it, and that's why I really appreciate it a great deal. The next song, which is a collaboration again with McLaury, is You Need to Be Loved, and I heard this on the Rare Classic CD. This sounds like something that Charles Stepney would have done with Earth, Wind and Fire. It just has that fine wine kind of vibe. You'd think Jermaine Jackson had been writing and composing for years, when you heard that. This guy had a well-oiled sound on that song, and it was just a great mid-tempo kind of funky, well-produced kind of thing. On Strong Love, he did a duet with Sarita Wright, and she wrote the song with Greg Wright. And the thing about Strong Love, it's kind of a jaunty, up-tempo, soulful, honky-tonk thing. Think of Little Spinners, Games People Play, a little bit of a Billy Preston sound. It has that kind of vibe to it. Now, when we're talking serious funk, Jermaine gets seriously into it with Get Up and Dance, and he is slapping his bass on that song while you wouldn't believe. And he has that great Jackson way with funk and melody on that song. I mean, it has such a Jackson sound of that era. He has the melody and he has the funk combined into one, and that's a great song for that. Now, the second side of the album begins with a ballad, I Love You More, which is a really well-arranged one, too. And Some Kind of Woman is also very similar in that vein. Now, Happiness is, it isn't Barry White or Isaac Hayes or anything like that, but, with its, moog bass kind of flowing in and out of it, it's very much the closest thing I've ever heard to Jermaine doing a cinematic soul thing. Now, he didn't write that song, but it really came through well. Now, Gotta Get to You Girl is a song written solely by Jermaine, and the whole vibe of it is, an update of the Jackson 5's earlier days in terms of sound. Now, Michael McLaury, I hope I pronounced his name right, wrote the last song on the album called Take Time. Another good funky soul thing, which has good juxtaposition. It starts out very melodic and gets into a funky groove toward the end. A lot of great harmonies. Also good for the disco era, which was really starting to happen at that particular time. So this was actually a very important album in terms of, 1977. And I'll just take the album out. There's nothing special about the jacket. I don't know if you can see it. I'm trying to show it in the light, but I think you can see it right there. This album could use some serious cleaning or replacement, but I might keep this because this is part of a vinyl collection I had, as hard as it is to believe now, where all the vinyl I had fit in a little tiny vinyl case in my all-in-one CD vinyl cassette deck that I had at the time. I think I had about 4 or 5 vinyl albums, and about 3 of them were Jermaine's, and this was one of them. And it wasn't in bad shape when I got it, but I just wore this out. You know, it's one of those albums I've worn out. And I'm also going to make a little tiny plea in this video. You know, anybody out there who are major funk fans, major Jackson fans, who have heard this album or any of Jermaine's records, I think somebody ought to think about starting a petition to reissue Jermaine's catalog, you know, in some sort of digitized format, either on CD with bonus cuts. There's got to be stuff out there. I know Jermaine made a whole solo album in the mid-'70s. You can hear cuts of it on YouTube sometimes that was never released. That's how messed up the situation seemed to be over at Motown. They just weren't prioritizing his solo career that much. And this album really should have been. You know, when I listened to this would have gone fine with all those funk albums I mentioned that came out in '77. So this is kind of, you know, on the more obscure end of 1977 in terms of funk release. You know, an album that didn't really get that big at its time, but, you know, if you see it, definitely pick it up. And I hope Amazon or streaming services make Jermaine albums from this era available. You know, Hippo Select would really be good putting out a reissue of this too, but this is just really an amazing album. And, you know, this is actually, video is a good template for, you know, somewhat slept on things from '87 and 1977 that I wish to champion, you know, this year when I do my vinyl overviews and vinyl reviews and such. So hopefully I'll be coming back with a collection video where I go through a collection of something. It might be an update, or it might be a year in music, but these vinyl reviews, you know, I don't know if they're communicating with the audience, or even to myself, as much as I want them to. I'd rather go through collections and talk about those, but I hope this made an impact on you. So, you know, if you see this album around, don't think, oh, it's a Jermaine album from the '70s that's only okay and inconsistent. If you love your funk and you love your soul, this is an amazing album. Really well written, superbly played on, and some amazing slap bass work and funky vocals from Jermaine. Just an amazing album. So, until next time, enjoy your music.